How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the show. On this episode, we get the parts I needed to fix the reverse idler gear arm and detent, take everything I cleaned last episode and assemble the transaxle, then add some custom linkage and a custom shifter from only944.com and get the trans installed in the car. So stay tuned. I took the trans over to my buddy Jeff's and we tore the thing apart. I've got it pretty much cleaned up and some parts ordered, and I'm just checking here to see if I can find my key to see if I've got anything yet. Oh yeah, something. Oh, what did I get? Yup, that's my Auto Atlanta. That is my Auto Atlanta. Yeah, baby. Yeah, baby. Well, aside from the broken reverse detent and the bent spring and the 5th gear synchro, everything else inside the trans looked good. So I decided to go ahead and see if I could get this thing put back together myself. I could get all the parts for less than $100, and that way I could get it in the car, see how it does, and go from there. I ordered most of the parts I needed to fix my trans from Auto Atlanta. I ordered a new reverse detent, or what they call a transmission sleeve, and the spring to go with it. Then I ordered new seals for the screw caps that cover the same style detents on the 5th gear / reverse gear shifter rod, the main shifter rod, the 3/4 shifter rod, and the 1/2 shifter rod. Then I ordered new springs for the detents inside the 5th gear synchro mesh. And then I got a gasket for the shifter rod cover, a new seal for the other end of that rod, a new input shaft seal, a new end cap for the rear of the trans, and a new gasket for the end cover. I also got 2 axle seals from Pelican and this RTV silicone from Amazon.
Eventually,
It was all in here. It's all in here. So this goes in the front. You press it in and the input shaft goes through here. New gasket for that, new gasket for that. 2 new springs for the bent springs that are in the 5th gear synchronizer. A end cap to go on the end of the transmission. I got a new spring to go on the detent shifter shaft thing seal. The seals for the caps that cover the detents on the rest of the shift rods. And there's the transmission sleeve that I call the detent that Auto Atlanta had to get straight from Porsche. Alright guys, I've got the new part and the spring. I'm gonna put that in here. I've got the arm that I've got tapped out and the new bolt. I'm gonna wash my hands and we'll put some gloves on. Those gloves are funny. I ran out of regular gloves, so I just decided to use these. So there's the spring and the detent. And finally I can put this thing back together. So you thread the bolt in part way, and then you have to hold the arm under pressure because now that detent is pushing on it. In like where you think it needs to go in the center of that detent, and then thread the bolt through the arm. It's a little difficult to get this lined up right the first time. I had to mess with it a few times to get it exactly right. But it's possible, and you just have to spend some time doing it. I think it needs to come in just a little bit. And while I was doing that, my buddy Melvin came over and cut a piece of exhaust with a chain style exhaust cutter. It's kind of interesting to see how quickly he was able to cut through that pipe.
Hey.
Yeah. Holy crap, nice. So it's just a chain.
Yeah.
Huh.
And then you loop it through here like that. The excess goes up the top.
Oh, okay. It won't cut stainless, but on regular steel, seems to work good enough.
It doesn't cut exactly straight, but then again, I only paid $20 for the tool, so.
Yeah. Nice.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I got that arm lined up right on top of the center of the detent, and then poured some transmission fluid on there just to make sure it was lubed for reassembly. And there it is, a fixed reverse detent arm. So now we can start putting this thing back together. And I started with the 5th gear synchronizer. Alright, so I've got these keys all cleaned up. They were filled with gook and friction material. So there's the new springs. In the manual, they show this spring actually sitting in this recess here. So I put the selector ring over the hub there and then fed those keys in, and it's more difficult to get the spring on the side here that has that like recess and then the gear attached to it. You kind of have to tuck it in there It's a little screwy. Just have to kind of do it like that, I guess. There. And then here I'm just snapping the ring on the top. You're supposed to do this 120 degrees off from the one on the other side. Yeah, and then there's a synchronizer on the top. Like that. There it is, ready for assembly later. The springs on the same style detents for the 3/4 synchronizer hub there were in the wrong spot. The keys weren't in the right spot on the end of those springs. So I took this shaft apart halfway so I could get to the top spring. There's a clip. There's a gear for 3rd gear. And the synchronizer on top of it comes off like that. Bearings are in 2 pieces underneath here. And then there's a C-clip there. I could have just left it there because I didn't end up taking this apart any further. But if you want to remove the synchronizer hub there, then you would take that C-clip off and then pound or press that hub off the shaft. I just decided to straighten out the springs at this point without taking it apart any further. There is the selector ring that goes over the top. There's the 2nd spring that I'm going to put back in here in a second. Get the keys out of my parts cleaner and clean them up a little bit more. I let them sit in there for quite a while and it softened up the goo that was inside of those pretty well. Use some Q-tips and then clean them up again with some brake parts cleaner. Put some WD-40 on them so they had some lubricant on there, and then reassembled the synchronizer on the shaft. I marked it out there where the springs were facing, so I knew when I flipped it over, I knew where I had to put the spring on the other side. There's a selector ring. That's true. That just goes together like that. There we go. And here I'm snapping the top ring in place. And here I'm putting it back together. C-clip goes on. Make sure it's tucked in there. 2-part bearings. I made sure that there was some oil on there for reassembly. And then the gear. And that C-clip. And once I had it all back together, I dumped some transmission fluid on there so it was lubricated for reassembly. Luckily, I had an engine stand that was at my dad's house. So my dad brought the stand over for me along with some metric bolts that fit the bell housing. And once we knew that it was going to work and had it set up, we pulled the case back off of the stand so I could put in a new input shaft seal and clean up the rest of the gasket material that was left on the case around the cover for the differential carrier. There was a little nick in the metal where the input shaft seal goes in. So I got out the Dremel and just buffed that out so that it was absolutely smooth before I put in the seal. And we covered up the bearings really well to make sure that no grit or grime would get in there while I buffed out that nick. I was debating, I was like, should I do it?
I would do it, but if it were me, because I think it's got a pretty good lip on there.
I put some black RTV on the outside of that seal just to be safe, and then pressed it in. Oh geez, I just pushed that in. There I'm just cleaning up that silicone and putting some trans fluid on the inside of the seal. Actually, I've got to clean the crap off of the... I still needed to get the hardened gasket material off of the lip for the cover. So I started with a razor blade, but then we switched to a small wire wheel on the Dremel, and that actually worked really well. It took off the residue, but it didn't damage the aluminum. Alright, so we're going to start putting this thing together. First thing I put in is that cover there that snaps up in the corner and blocks the transmission fluid from going up into the breather hole that's on the top of the trans. I went through all the shift rods and the forks that are pressed onto those rods and filed down any sharp edges and any nicks and scrapes that were there from pounding these press fit parts apart during disassembly. Alright, now it's time to assemble this housing and get it ready to slide into the main transaxle case. There's 2 of these pins and they ride in the chamber that's machined for them in between the 3 shifter rods that slide in those 3 holes there in the gear housing. They go standing up and then they sit in their own little machine channel like this between the shafts, and it's just kind of a pain in the butt getting them in there. They stand up straight like that between the rods, and the only way to get them in there is to feed them down through that hole there in the top. Once you get them in there, you need them to stay in place, so the trick is to cover them with a thick grease, and then the grease holds them in place so you can slide the rods into those holes later. I gotta put it down in here like this. I used that magnet there and a small screwdriver to get the first pin into the top slot, and then I pushed that pin down into the second slot and then put the second pin in the first slot. Then I got out some oil and some grease and got ready to assemble the gear housing. You have to start by setting the counter shaft into the case first, along with the 1-2 shift rod, and make sure the shift fork is in the right spot on top of the selector. Next I put in these 2 detents, but starting with these before you set in the counter shaft makes the most sense. These go down inside that hole. I put oil on these to start, but later I used grease as it holds them in place better, but it's also there for sliding the rods in place on top of them. After doing this, I figured out you have to push down on the top of those detents in order to get the rods to slide into the passageway on top of them. There I'm getting the first rod into its corresponding hole and then putting in the main input shaft. First you feed the reverse fork onto that rod and then set that rod in the case. Then you feed that fork over the rod and set it in place into its selector ring and get that lined up in its hole. Now you can pound in the pin. There I'm flipping it around and then getting that arm hooked into the reverse either gear arm. And now I can put in the middle shift rod. It has a hole machined through the center of it. This little pin goes in. It literally slides into the shaft, if you can see that. Like that. You need to have the rods lined up in the neutral position in order to get the pins that are between those rods into the recess that are machined into the rods, so then you can slide the third rod in place and past all those pins without them binding on each other. I just basically went back and forth until I figured out how I had them all in the right spot, and basically those pins were then lined up so that they were all in the right recesses and all the rods were in the right neutral position. I'm not going to put the seal on here. I'm just going to screw these in here right now to hold these in place while I finish putting the last fork on the rod and then pound the pins in place. I got in there and cleaned off the case where the cap that holds the detent for the 5th gear rod screws into the case. And then finally put some grease and the new seals on the caps that cover the other 2 shift rods. And voila, the gear case is assembled and ready to slide into the main case. And I am getting ready to try putting that part into this part. I went through my bolts to make sure I had all my bolts. So I gotta take these back out. I just put them in there for now. And to start, I have to put this cover on in place and basically secure the ring and pinion. So I cleaned up the edge of the cover there, made sure there was no sharp metal. And then I did the same thing on that beveled edge on the inside of the case there. Made sure it was clean, and then put some lube on the bearings of the carrier and the bearing race, and then lower the carrier down into the case. Put a little bit of oil on the lip and the lip inside of here. I've got the gooey stuff on here. Checked it with the bolts to make sure they were centered, and then tapped the cover over a little bit before I finally tapped it down all the way. These bolts seemed to torque really easily when I set the torque on them. So just to be sure, I actually tightened them down, then I loosened all the bolts and I re-torqued them down again just to make sure that cover was absolutely pressed down all the way. And then torqued the bolts twice just to make sure with 2 different wrenches. So you basically just have to find the holes that those rods slip into at the same time, you know, kind of be careful so that that shaft doesn't catch on any of the needle bearings that the input shaft slides through. And then also be careful when you're getting it through the main seal in the front, because you don't want to hit that seal and push it out or mess it up in any way. Next goes on the shim and the first gear for the 5th gear assembly. You have to put that on first before you put on the synchronizer for the 5th gear. And that bolt is just going in temporarily. I tighten it again later with some Loctite. And then you put on those bearings. I made sure to put some oil on there. So here is the 5th gear synchro mesh and selector. Here I'm pounding them onto that rod. Put the screwdriver in there to hold that rod because without it, that rod wanted to push in. I just stuck the screwdriver in the hole for the reverse light switch and then pried on the end of it while I pounded the 5th gear selector onto that rod. You have to heat up the bearing races in order to get them on the shaft. And you're supposed to heat them up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So I just heated them up with my heat gun to where I felt like it was right. And then once you get them hot, they go on pretty easily. And then now you can take the bolt back out of that gear and tighten it to torque specs because you can actually hold the transaxle from spinning. They've got blue Loctite on the threads from the factory, so I'm cleaning the old stuff off and putting some new stuff on and then threading that bolt in. And I decided to use a rag. I was able to just wedge the rag in there and that actually prevented the main shaft from spinning so I could torque that bolt. There I'm putting in the dowel pins and then just dumping some extra oil on the fork and the selector ring. I was going to use these to torque against because I've got the bolts in there backwards so that they pry on the side of the case. For some reason I didn't. I ended up just using a screwdriver, which is kind of funny. We'll see it in a little bit. There's a seal for the shifter rod. I put some oil in the case and then pounded that in with a socket. It went in pretty easy. And then here I'm actually putting in the rod itself. I put some grease and some oil on that spring. And then here's the gasket for the cover, the gasket maker. I decided to use the gasket maker because the cover was kind of pitted. I think you can use this sealed dry, but I just decided to do it this way. And then put some grease on the face of that nylon ring there. And then that cover sets into that spring and it's under tension, so you have to push the cover down as you tighten the bolts up. They sell a short shifting version of this linkage. I might get one in the future. For now, I just decided to reuse it. I just put on the cover, put that gasket on dry, and then I put the bolts in the cover first, but I didn't tighten them down until after I put the bearing races on. And then this is just the race that goes on the other side of the bearing that's in the end of that cover. Doing the same thing, heating it up and pounding it on. I've got that bolt there ready to go with some fresh Loctite on it. And then I tried to push that shaft back as much as I could because it seemed like that's where it was supposed to be. I wanted to take as much play out of the transaxle as I could. I held that shaft back and then torqued it down. Now it might have worked if I would have used the hubs on either side with the bolts in them to pry against the case. But I ended up just using the screwdriver instead. I moved it over to a different spot so I could actually get some real leverage on it without that screwdriver bending. And then here I'm doing it over there and doing it a couple times to make sure it was good. and then I put the thing back on the stand. So you want to put the cover on, but you have to torque the bolts that are underneath the cover first, because once you put that cover on there, you can't reach them. So there I'm torquing those bolts, and then you put the cover on, and then run the bolts through the cover and torque those bolts too. Then I put some oil on it and pounded in that end cover, screwed in the fill plugs, and then put some grease on the reverse light switch and screwed that in place. So here is the custom linkage I got from only944.com. It comes with spherical rod ends that are more precise than just the rubber bushings that are in the sheet metal factory linkage. And it seems like it comes set up to the same length that the stock linkage is. Alright, so they give you a thick washer that goes underneath here like that, and then 2 washers for either side of this arm. And for some reason, they give you a lock washer and a nylon lock nut. So I guess just to be safe, we'll use both. I'm gonna put this thing on. So you just thread the one end there into the case, and then the other end that attaches to the arm is adjustable. 1 washer goes on either side of that linkage there, and then on goes the lock washer and then the nylon lock nut. If you're putting one of these on your trans while it's in the car, you need a really short wrench to tighten the one end down into the case. And only944.com sells an inexpensive 11mm wrench on their website. Unlike the stock shifter, the Only 944 shifter has a bolt and nut that sticks out of the side of the shifter itself. So to give the shifter enough room for full movement up in the cabin, I set my linkage up off to the side like that. After it was tight, I checked the jam nuts to make sure they were tight. And voila, more precise shift linkage. And last but not least, the breather cap. I didn't get video of it, but I did put in the new axle seals as well. If you want to see how it's done, you can go back and check out my early episode titled How to Install a 924S/944 Transaxle. Before I put my trans back in the car, I'm going to install one of these aftermarket shifters from only944.com. Unlike the stock shifter that doesn't use any bearings or a bushing, these are designed with bearings that sit on either side of the shift linkage that runs to the back of the transmission. This shifter should never wear out, so you start by removing that carpeting cover there, and then there I'm pulling off my old inner shift boot. That's the package that the new shifter comes in. And I vacuumed out all the crud that was in there. Basically the foam had started to deteriorate, so I got all that out of there. And then there's 2 bolts that hold the shifter down to the top of the tunnel. So I removed those, and I'm going to be reusing that nylon bushing there, so I have to remove it. You can see how worn out my stock shifter was there. So the new shifter is slightly taller than the old shifter, and I think they do that to basically give that bolt that sticks out of the side some extra space so that it doesn't hit the inside of the hole in the tunnel. You can see that the bolt is slightly higher than where the original stud is on the stock shifter, so you would think that that would shorten the throw. But then the handle itself is actually a little taller. So between the two, the throw of the shifter probably is pretty close to stock. voila, there it is. When you put this back in, you need to make sure that bushing is in the right location with the curve matching the top of the tunnel. Then I removed the bolt from the handle. I got underneath the car and pulled the rod all the way back to give myself some room. Got in there and vacuumed it out again. And then here I am putting the bolts into the top of that plate that mounts it to the top of the tunnel. So I tested it out here first to see how it went together. And then once I knew that it was pretty easy to get that bolt threaded through there, I took it back apart and greased everything. I cut a strip of fabric and I ran it through the end of the rod there to clean out the end where the stud for the stock shifter goes through. And then I decided to put some grease inside of the end of the rod there. Then I took the bolt and took the greased bearings, put the first one on the bolt, then fed the bolt through the end of the rod, and then placed the second bearing on the other side, and then screwed that bolt into the shifter. The trick here is to tighten this bolt that runs through the shifter down tight enough so that there isn't any excess play, but loose enough so that it still does move and it doesn't bind or anything as you go through the motions with the shifter. Basically, you just have to mess with it until you get the adjustment right and get it to a spot where you like it. And then once I got it to where I liked it, then I could put some Loctite on the other end of that bolt and thread the nut on. And then here I'm just setting it up once more, testing it out, and then tightening it up to the point where I felt like it worked the best, and then tightened it down for good. And there it is. And it seemed to feel pretty good.
I'll leave it there, I guess.
Also, it just tapped the top of the plastic there when I put it up into reverse. So it seemed like where I had it adjusted was gonna work. So I took it off the stand and then cleaned up the input shaft with a wire brush, put some grease on it to get ready for that coupler. All right, it's time to put this thing back in. I already did an episode where I covered putting in one of these transaxles in depth, so if you want more info on how to do that, go ahead and check out one of my early episodes titled How to Install a 924S/944 Transaxle. After I got the trans in, I ran to AutoZone and I picked up some 75 90-way gear oil, and I got the kind that doesn't have any friction modifier added. I don't have the shifter stuff put on there yet because I want to make sure this thing is going to work, so let's see if I did it or not. Dun dun dun! Ain't making the noise it was before, that's good. Well, there it is, guys, a reassembled transaxle. If you have any questions about what I did in this episode, write it in a comment down in the comment section. I'll be sure to get back to you. And if you have any comments in general, be sure to leave those too. I really like to hear what you guys have to say. Thanks for watching the show, guys. Lots more to come in the future, so be sure to check back for new episodes of Project Porsche. And shout out to my subscribers. Thanks for subscribing, guys. See you next time.